Eleanor adjusted her silk dress, glancing at the mirror before stepping into the grand dining room. The chandelier above cast a golden glow on the long, polished table where Charles sat, scanning his phone. He barely looked up as she entered. Decades of marriage had reduced their conversations to formal exchanges and forced pleasantries.
The doorbell rang.
Eleanor's heart quickened. She smoothed her hair and walked gracefully to the door. David stood there, suitcase in hand. His eyes, a mix of exhaustion and grief, met hers. He had always been handsome, his sharp jawline, the intensity in his gaze, but tonight, he looked vulnerable. "You look exhausted, dear," Eleanor cooed, placing a hand on his arm. "Come in." David stepped inside, scanning the house he had visited as a child. Everything seemed the same, yet different. The air felt heavier. The silence between Eleanor and Charles was thick, suffocating. "David," Charles said flatly, nodding before returning to his phone. Eleanor led David to the table, pouring him a glass of wine before he could refuse. "You must be starving. Let me fix you something." As she walked to the kitchen, she could feel David's eyes on her. It wasn't new. She had noticed it before, the way his gaze lingered a second too long. He probably wasn't even aware of it himself. But Eleanor was. Olivia arrived soon after, draping her coat over the chair beside David. "It's been ages," she purred, resting a hand on his knee under the table.
He stiffened.
Eleanor's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Olivia had always been like this, playing with fire, testing limits. "Victor's coming too," Olivia added, smirking at Eleanor. "I thought it'd be fun to have everyone together again." Eleanor sipped her wine. Fun. That wasn't the word she'd use. When Victor arrived, the energy in the room shifted. He exuded charm, his presence commanding attention. He greeted Eleanor with a knowing smile, brushing a hand over hers briefly before turning to David. "Haven't seen you in years, kid. Grown up well." David forced a chuckle, uncomfortable with the way Victor sized him up. Eleanor, however, was too familiar with Victor's games to be fazed. Dinner was a performance. Conversations danced between polite and suggestive, the air thick with hidden meanings. Olivia leaned into David, whispering something that made him blush. Eleanor, watching closely, felt a flicker of possessiveness she couldn't explain. As the night wore on, Charles excused himself early, barely acknowledging his guests. Eleanor refilled David's glass, her fingers brushing against his. A deliberate touch. His breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. Olivia noticed. She always noticed. She smirked, sipping her wine slowly, enjoying the silent war beginning to unfold. Victor, leaning back, studied them all. He had seen this before: Eleanor's hunger, Olivia's jealousy, David's confusion. It was all predictable, and yet it never ceased to amuse him. Sophia, clearing the plates, remained unnoticed. But she had seen everything, and secrets like these had a way of becoming currency. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Eleanor stood in the dimly lit hallway, watching the soft glow seeping from under David's door. She hesitated, gripping the silk belt of her robe. The wine had warmed her, but it wasn't just the alcohol. She knocked lightly. "David." A pause. Then, the door creaked open. He stood there, his shirt unbuttoned at the top, eyes searching hers. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured, stepping inside before he could respond. David swallowed hard, stepping back. The room felt smaller with her in it. He had been trying to push away the thoughts he shouldn't be having. But here she was, standing so close, her perfume wrapping around him like a spell. Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed, looking up at him. "You've been through a lot," she said softly, placing a hand on his wrist. "You don't have to go through it alone." He should have stopped her. He should have stepped away. But he didn't. Her fingers trailed up his arm, slow, deliberate. His breath hitched. "Eleanor." His voice was barely a whisper. She tilted her head, watching him. "Tell me you don't want this." David's resolve shattered. He kissed her. Hard. Years of restraint crumbled in an instant. She pulled him down onto the bed, her nails digging into his back. It was wrong, but it felt inevitable. The sheets twisted around them, bodies tangled in a feverish urgency neither could control. She gasped as he moved against her, taking everything she offered. When it was over, silence settled between them. David lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Eleanor traced lazy circles on his chest, utterly content. "You're overthinking," she murmured. He turned to her, conflicted. This can't happen again." Eleanor smiled, pressing a finger to his lips. "Don't make promises you can't keep." The door clicked shut behind her as she slipped out. Downstairs, Olivia sipped her wine, a slow smirk creeping across her lips. She had seen Eleanor leave David's room. She had been expecting it. By morning, Olivia made her move. She found David alone in the kitchen, his hair still tousled from the night before. "You look tired," she teased, trailing a finger along his arm. David stiffened. "Olivia." She leaned in. "Relax. I won't tell." His pulse pounded. "But," she continued, lips brushing his ear, "if you think last night was something, you should see what I can do." Before he could react, she kissed him. Unlike Eleanor, Olivia was all fire and demand. He tried to pull away, but she pressed closer, making sure he felt every inch of her. He wanted to resist, but the damage was already done. By the time Olivia walked away, she knew she had him exactly where she wanted. And upstairs, Eleanor watched from the balcony, gripping the railing, realizing she had just made a mistake. Eleanor sat in front of her vanity, running a brush through her hair. The reflection staring back at her was calm, composed, but beneath the surface, something burned. She had seen Olivia kiss David. She had seen the way he didn't push her away fast enough. Her fingers tightened around the brush. Downstairs, Olivia hummed softly, pouring herself a drink. She knew Eleanor had seen. That was the point. She wanted her to. David entered the room, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked exhausted, guilty. "Olivia." She turned, smirking. "You don't have to explain. It's just fun, isn't it?" David hesitated. "I don't think." "Sure." She pressed a finger against his lips, then dragged it slowly down his chest. "You didn't say no last night." He exhaled sharply. "This is getting out of hand." She leaned closer, her lips barely touching his ear. "It already has." Upstairs, Eleanor poured herself a drink, then another. She wasn't angry at David. No, she had expected him to be weak. But Olivia? That was betrayal. She needed to remind them both who was in control. Later that evening, when Charles came home, Eleanor greeted him with a slow, deliberate kiss. He was surprised but didn't resist. Olivia, watching from across the room, narrowed her eyes. Eleanor smiled against Charles's lips, knowing exactly what she was doing. Victor arrived not long after, sensing the shift in the air. He had been with Eleanor before, knew her patterns. She only played these games when she felt threatened. When they were alone, he ran a hand down her arm. "You're slipping, Eleanor." She met his gaze. "And you think you can catch me?" He chuckled. "I always do." She let him kiss her, let his hands explore the way they used to. If Olivia wanted to play, Eleanor would remind everyone she had played this game first. But Olivia wasn't the only one watching. Sophia, quiet as ever, stood just out of sight, observing. She knew too much already, but now she had something more valuable. A secret worth keeping. Or selling. By midnight, the house was alive with tension. David avoided Eleanor's gaze. Olivia smirked at every glance in her direction. Charles remained oblivious. Victor, ever the spectator, sipped his drink and watched the chaos unfold. Eleanor leaned in close to him. "I want Olivia gone." He raised a brow. "And what do I get in return?" She ran a finger down his chest. "Anything you want." Victor smirked. "Consider it done." Upstairs, Sophia slipped into her room and locked the door. Secrets had power, and soon, she'd decide which one was worth the most. David sat on the edge of his bed, running his hands through his hair.
His thoughts were a tangled mess.
He had made a mistake, a series of them. Eleanor, Olivia, nothing about this felt right anymore. the weight of it pressed down on his chest, suffocating. A knock at his door made him tense. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to deal with whatever came next. But the knocking didn't stop. When he finally swung the door open, Charles stood there. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes David hadn't seen before. "Come downstairs," Charles said, voice steady but cold. David followed, pulse pounding. In the living room, Eleanor sat with a glass of wine, legs crossed, perfectly poised. Olivia lounged on the couch, her smirk barely contained. Victor stood by the fireplace, swirling his drink, amused by the unfolding drama. Sophia, standing in the shadows, watched everything in silence. Charles turned to Eleanor. "Tell me the truth." She tilted her head.
About what?
His jaw tightened. "About you and David." Silence. David's stomach dropped. He looked at Eleanor, searching for a denial, a way out. But she only took a slow sip of her wine, as if deciding how much damage she wanted to inflict. Olivia laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, Charles, you really don't know your wife at all, do you?" Charles's hands curled into fists. He turned to David. "Is it true?" David couldn't speak. Eleanor finally set her glass down. "Does it really matter now?" The crack of the slap echoed through the room before anyone had time to react. Charles had never touched Eleanor like that before, but tonight, restraint was a foreign concept. Victor whistled under his breath. Well, that escalated quickly. David stood, fists clenched, ready to defend Eleanor, but she stopped him with a look. "Don't," she murmured. Charles turned on Olivia next. "And you? Sleeping with my stepson while pretending to be my friend." She shrugged, entirely unbothered. "You were never faithful to Eleanor either. Don't act righteous now." Sophia finally stepped forward, clearing her throat. "If we're laying everything on the table, Victor hasn't exactly been innocent either." All eyes turned to him. He grinned, unbothered. "Guilty as charged." The room was on the verge of collapse. Too many affairs, too many betrayals, too much resentment boiling over at once. David turned to Eleanor. "Was I just a game to you?" For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Regret? Maybe.
But she wouldn't say it.
"You were exactly what I needed you to be." It was enough. David walked out without another word. Charles followed soon after. Olivia left next, tossing one last smirk at Eleanor before disappearing into the night. Victor downed the rest of his drink. Well, that was entertaining. Sophia watched Eleanor closely. "What now?" Eleanor picked up her wine glass, unfazed. "We rebuild." But this time, she would be the only one left standing.